My sister took my inheritance, but she never anticipated that I would stand up and win. The story of my family is far from simple. My name is Samantha, though most people call me Sam. I'm 29, and I've put in a lot of effort to build a secure life for myself. I have a decent job, a modest savings, and a family dynamic that has shaped me in ways I'm still coming to understand. My younger sister, Madison, Maddie for short, is 26, and to anyone who doesn't know us well, she's the ideal golden child. Maddie has this ability to walk into any room and become the focal point. People are drawn to her in a way I've never quite grasped. It could be her confidence, or how she makes you feel like you're the only one who matters when she talks to you. Either way, it's always worked to her advantage. When we were kids, she could spill a drink on the carpet, and our parents would laugh it off as just Maddie being Maddie. Meanwhile, I'd get scolded for not noticing the spill earlier and cleaning it up before they noticed. Our parents, Caroline and Richard, never overtly admitted their favoritism, but it was evident in the subtle ways Maddie's mistakes were quickly forgotten, while mine were scrutinized, dissected, and sometimes even brought up years later as lessons. For years I tried to accept it. I focused on my grades, got a part-time job as soon as I was old enough, and did my best to stay out of trouble. While this didn't win me the same love Maddie received, I hoped it would at least earn me respect. My saving grace was my grandparents, Helen and Frank. They lived about 20 minutes away in a charming old house that always felt like a second home to me. The house was old, but had character. Creaky floorboards that squeaked with each step. Helen's pride was her garden, filled with rows of lavender that perfumed the air with its calming scent. Unlike my parents, Helen and Frank didn't play favorites. They treated Maddie and me the same, and in their quiet way, they made me feel seen in a way my parents never did. Weekends at their house were my escape. Helen taught me how to bake, and Frank shared stories about his youth, weaving tales of resilience and family bonds that felt like they were meant just for me. When they passed away recently, it felt like a part of me had gone with them. I knew they were getting older, but they had always been so full of life that it was hard to picture the world without them. Their deaths came just months apart, as though they couldn't bear to be apart from each other. Losing them was like losing the anchors that kept me steady. At the funeral, Maddie showed up late, classic Maddie. She swept into the room like a movie star, wearing a designer dress that screamed for attention. Her bright smile and casual laughter didn't fit the somber atmosphere, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone flocked to her, drawn to her like moths to a flame. I sat quietly in a corner, trying to hold back my tears, while Maddie worked the room as if it were a cocktail party. Our parents, predictably, couldn't get enough of her. They hung on every word she said, as though she were the one keeping the family together instead of the one tearing it apart. I reminded myself that we were there to honor Helen and Frank, and this wasn't the time for old grievances to resurface. After the funeral, I focused on the little comfort I could find. Helen and Frank had always made it clear that they wanted me to have their house when they were gone. It wasn't just a house to me. It represented everything they had given me: stability, love, and a place where I truly felt I belonged. I thought about all the weekends I spent there, sitting in the kitchen with Helen while she wrote down recipes for me in her elegant handwriting, or helping Frank pull weeds in the garden while he shared life lessons about hard work. That house wasn't just theirs. It was ours. A few weeks after the funeral, I got a call from their lawyer, and I assumed it was to go over the details of the will. The house and part of their estate were supposed to go to me, as they had always said. I expected the conversation to be straightforward, but it wasn't. The lawyer started reading through the will, and my name wasn't mentioned, neither for the house nor for any part of the estate. Nothing. I sat there stunned, trying to process what I was hearing. He went on to explain that Maddie had been named the primary beneficiary. She got everything. I couldn't believe it. Helen and Frank had always been so clear about their intentions. This had to be some kind of mistake. I asked the lawyer if he was sure, and he confirmed that the will had been updated just a few weeks before they passed away. When I called Maddie to ask her about it, she acted surprised. "Oh, wow," she said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I had no idea. Maybe they thought you didn't need the money since you have a good job." I hung up the phone, feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. Something about her tone didn't feel right. She wasn't just surprised. She sounded smug. I started digging through old emails and messages from Helen and Frank. searching for anything that might explain this sudden change. That's when I found it. A scanned copy of an earlier version of their will. It was exactly what I had always believed. I was named as the primary beneficiary of the house and a large portion of the estate. I confronted Maddie with the copy, but she shrugged it off. "That's probably an old draft," she said. "It doesn't matter if it's not the final version." She accused me of being ungrateful and stirring up drama. When I tried to bring it up with our parents, they told me to let it go. "What's done is done," my mom said. "There's no point in tearing the family apart over this." But I couldn't let it go. Helen and Frank trusted me. They made their wishes clear, and I wasn't going to let Maddie rewrite their story. Something about the timing of the updated will, so close to their deaths, felt off. The Maddie I knew wouldn't have hesitated to push boundaries to get what she wanted. I made up my mind. If Maddie thought she could get away with this, she was wrong. Helen and Frank had always taught me to stand up for what was right, and that's exactly what I planned to do. For the first time in years, I wasn't going to let Maddie win. After finding the old copy of the will, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Helen and Frank weren't the type to make sudden decisions without telling me. They were careful, deliberate people who had always been transparent about their plans. So for the will to be changed so suddenly, so close to their passing, didn't add up. I decided to speak to their lawyer again. His office was downtown, tucked into one of those aging brick buildings that seemed to reflect my growing frustration. I sat in the waiting room, tapping my foot anxiously on the worn carpet, rehearsing what I was going to say. When I finally sat across from him, I tried to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was pounding. I asked him to walk me through the details again, pressing him about how the changes to the will had come about. At first he hesitated, hiding behind vague statements about confidentiality, but I wasn't backing down. After what felt like an eternity, he finally admitted something that made my stomach turn. Maddie had been heavily involved in the process. She had visited the office multiple times, claiming she was helping Helen and Frank update their documents. She had even provided some of the paperwork herself, saying it was at their request. "Did my grandparents mention this to you?" I asked him directly. He hesitated. "Not to me personally, no. Most of the communication came through your sister." It felt like a punch to the gut. Maddie had somehow inserted herself into the process, acting as if she was speaking on their behalf. My mind raced with questions. How had she managed to convince them to change everything? Had she pressured them? Tricked them? The timing, just weeks before their deaths, only deepened my suspicion. I left the lawyer's office feeling more determined than ever. If Maddie thought she could quietly rewrite my grandparents' wishes, she was wrong. I confronted her again that evening. I called her, and for once, I didn't hold back. "Maddie, I spoke to the lawyer. He said you were involved in changing the will. What exactly did you say to them?" She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that made my blood boil. "Sam, are you serious? You're acting like I held a gun to their heads. They were adults. They made their own decisions." I tried to press her further, but she doubled down, accusing me of being jealous and bitter. "Honestly, Sam, this isn't about you. Maybe they thought I deserved it. Did you ever think of that?" Her words stung, but they didn't break me. If anything, they fueled my determination. This wasn't just about me. It was about Helen and Frank and the trust they placed in me. As the days went by, the tension in the family grew. When I tried to talk to my parents about what I had discovered, they brushed me off. "Maddie wouldn't do something like that," my mom said, her tone firm. "You're reading too much into this. She's always been there for them," my dad added, as if sporadic visits in their final months somehow outweighed years of my devotion. Their refusal to even entertain the idea that Maddie could have manipulated the situation was infuriating. I was being painted as the troublemaker, the one causing problems, while Maddie played the innocent victim. Still, I wasn't about to back down. I started digging deeper into the timeline, trying to piece together what really happened in those final weeks. I went through old text messages, emails, and even photos, looking for any clue that might explain how Maddie had pulled this off. Then I found something. A scanned email from Helen, sent about 2 months before her passing. In it, she had written how much the house meant to me and how she knew I would take care of it. She had said, This house is part of our family's history, and we know you'll honor that." It was exactly the kind of statement that proved their intentions had been clear. I saved the email, along with every other piece of evidence I could find. A few weeks later, at a family gathering, the divide became even more apparent. Maddie floated around the room, her laughter ringing out as she entertained relatives with stories of her recent good fortune. I watched as she carefully avoided making eye contact with me. My cousins, aunts, and uncles, who had always been warm toward me, now seemed distant. Maddie had clearly been spreading her version of events. Sam's being dramatic, or Sam's jealous, were the kinds of things I imagined her saying, and judging by the way people glanced at me across the room, I knew her words were working. One cousin, Luke, pulled me aside. "I heard there's some drama about the will," he said, his voice cautious. "Drama? Is that what Maddie's calling it?" I shot back, unable to hide my frustration. He held up his hands. "I'm not picking sides. I just want to know the truth." I explained everything, how Helen and Frank had always planned for me to have the house, how Maddie had somehow inserted herself into the process, and how the timing of the will's changes didn't add up. Luke listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. "You need to fight this," he said at last. "If what you're saying is true, Maddie crossed a line." His words offered a slight sense of validation, but I knew I needed more than just the support of one cousin. I needed concrete proof. My breakthrough came when I revisited the lawyer. This time, I directly inquired about the specific changes Maddie had requested. He hesitated, clearly uneasy. But after some pressing, he revealed that there were text messages and meeting logs that showed Maddie had been deeply involved in the process. "She was very persistent," he said carefully. I left his office with a mix of anger and resolve. Maddie wasn't just a passive beneficiary. She had orchestrated this. That night, I decided enough was enough. If Maddie wanted to manipulate, lie, and distort the truth, I would make sure the real story came to light. Helen and Frank had trusted me, and I wasn't about to let their legacy be tainted by Maddie's greed. The fight wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. For the first time, I felt like I was reclaiming control, not just over the inheritance, but over my own voice. Maddie had always been the one to dominate, to win, to charm her way through life, but not this time. This time, I would be the one to stand my ground. Once I had proof of Maddie's heavy involvement in changing my grandparents' will, I knew there was no turning back. If Helen and Frank had truly decided to alter their wishes, why hadn't they told me? Why was Maddie the middleman in every conversation with the lawyer? It didn't add up. I wasn't just fighting for the house or the inheritance. I was fighting for the truth. I began to build my case, piece by piece. Every email, text message, and note from Helen and Frank became another clue. I sifted through years of correspondence, looking for anything that might confirm what I already knew. That they had wanted me to have the house. One evening, while scrolling through old photos on my laptop, I stumbled upon a scanned letter Helen had written me years ago. It wasn't about the inheritance, but it reminded me of how much they had trusted me. In the letter, she wrote about how she and Frank believed I would carry on their legacy, how they saw me as someone who valued tradition. It wasn't much, but it was another reminder that their faith in me had been real. Meanwhile, Maddie wasn't hiding her newfound wealth. She had already bought herself a brand new luxury car, a sleek black model that stood out like a sore thumb in our parents' driveway. Every time I saw it, my frustration grew. It wasn't just the car, it was what it represented. Maddie had taken something that wasn't hers, and flaunted it like a trophy. I couldn't keep this fight to myself any longer. At a small family dinner one weekend, I decided to lay everything on the table. "Can we talk about the will?" I asked, breaking the awkward silence that hung in the air. Maddie rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair with that familiar smirk. "Oh, here we go again." "I'm serious, Maddie," I said firmly, refusing to let her dismiss me. "The lawyer told me you were heavily involved in making the changes. Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I didn't think it was a big deal," she replied casually. "Grandma and Grandpa asked me for help. I was just doing what they wanted." Her nonchalant tone made my blood boil. "They never mentioned any of this to me," I said. "Don't you think it's strange that they changed everything so close to their passing without telling anyone?" They didn't owe you an explanation, Maddie shot back, her voice rising. My parents jumped in before I could respond. Sam, enough, my mom said sharply. We don't need to keep dredging this up. Dredging it up? I repeated, my voice shaking. Mom, this isn't some petty argument. This is about Grandma and Grandpa's wishes. They trusted me. They wanted me to have the house, and Maddie stole that from me. Stole? Maddie scoffed, crossing her arms. That's rich, coming from someone who's making this all about herself. The argument escalated from there, with my parents defending Maddie and me, trying to get them to see reason. By the end of the night, I felt like I was yelling into a void. No one wanted to believe that Maddie could be capable of something so underhanded. But I wasn't alone. After the dinner, my cousin Luke pulled me aside. I believe you, he said quietly. Maddie's always had a way of twisting things to get what she wants. If you need help, let me know. Luke's support gave me a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I decided to dig deeper into the timeline of the will's changes. I reached out to the lawyer again, asking for more specifics about Maddie's involvement. At first, he was reluctant to share anything, but after I pressed him, he admitted that there were text messages and meeting notes that showed how Maddie had been orchestrating everything. She had visited the office multiple times in the weeks leading up to the changes, claiming she was helping Helen and Frank. Did they ever express any hesitation about the changes? I asked. The lawyer hesitated and then finally said, I can't say for certain, but they didn't seem fully aware of all the details. Maddie handled most of the communication. That was all I needed to hear. Maddie hadn't just taken advantage of the situation. She had manipulated Helen and Frank in their final days, when they were most vulnerable. Armed with this new information, I confronted Maddie again. This time, I didn't hold back. You lied to them, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You manipulated them into changing the will, didn't you? Her reaction was pure deflection. Oh, come on, Sam. You're really going to accuse me of that? You're making yourself look desperate. Don't turn this around on me, I snapped. I've spoken to the lawyer. I know what you did. She stared at me for a moment, her confident facade faltering just slightly before she regained her composure. You have no proof, she said coldly. But I did have proof, or at least the beginnings of it. The lawyer's records, the old will, and even Helen's email were enough to show that something wasn't right. Maddie must have sensed I wasn't going to back down because she quickly switched to a new tactic, painting herself as the victim. Over the next few weeks, she started spreading her own version of events to the rest of the family, accusing me of being obsessed with the inheritance. At family gatherings, I noticed the shift in how people treated me. Relatives who had once been warm now avoided me, clearly buying into Maddie's narrative. Even so, I refused to let her win. I continued piecing together the evidence, reaching out to anyone who might have insight into my grandparents' final months. That's when I got an unexpected call from a distant cousin, Emily. I heard about the will, she said cautiously. I just thought you should know. I have some old recordings of Grandma and Grandpa talking about their plans for the house. They were so proud of you, Sam. They always said they wanted you to have it. The recordings were a gift I hadn't expected. Hearing my grandparents' voices again was bittersweet, but it reminded me of why I was fighting so hard. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for them, for their memory, and for the trust they had placed in me. With each new piece of evidence, my resolve grew stronger. Maddie could twist the story all she wanted, but I was going to expose the truth. Helen and Frank had always taught me to stand up for what was right, and now I finally felt like I was doing just that. The day I decided to officially contest the will felt like stepping off a cliff. But I knew I had no other choice. Maddie had built a web of lies, and if I didn't fight back, she would get away with it. It wasn't just about the house or the money anymore. It was about standing up for Helen and Frank and everything they had trusted me to do. I hired a lawyer who specialized in contested wills. Her name was Catherine, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and fierce determination to see justice served. When I explained the situation to her, she listened carefully, asking questions to piece together the timeline. By the time I finished explaining the events, Catherine's expression had become stern. This isn't just about someone taking advantage, she said. If Maddie pressured your grandparents into changing their will or manipulated them in any way, That complicates things. We'll need to prove it. Her confidence gave me a glimmer of hope. She immediately began gathering all the evidence I had. The old will, Helen's email, the lawyer's records, and Emily's recordings. She also suggested hiring a forensic document examiner to analyze the signatures on the updated will. The timing is suspicious, Catherine said. If your grandparents were in poor health, we need to consider whether they could even fully comprehend what they were signing. The legal process was grueling. Maddie was served papers a few days later, and her reaction was immediate and predictable. She called me in a fury, screaming that I was ruining her life. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" she yelled over the phone. "You're tearing this family apart." "You did that when you manipulated Grandma and Grandpa," I shot back. "This is on you, Maddie." As expected, my parents quickly defended her. My mom called me later that day begging me to drop the case. "Sam, please," she pleaded. "This is only going to cause more pain for everyone." "Mom, it's already painful," I replied. "Maddie lied to all of us. She stole from Grandma and Grandpa. I can't just let that go." My dad, though quieter, was still disapproving. "Think about what this will do to the family," he said. "What about what she's already done?" I countered. "Why is it my responsibility to keep the peace when she's the one who caused all this?" Their silence spoke volumes. They didn't want to admit that Maddie might be in the wrong. As the case went on, more details about Maddie's actions surfaced. The forensic expert's analysis revealed significant discrepancies in the signatures on the updated will. According to the expert, the signatures didn't match my grandparents' usual handwriting. "These aren't just slight differences," the expert explained during a meeting with Catherine. "There are clear signs of forgery. Whoever signed this was trying to mimic their handwriting, but it's not authentic." Hearing those words was both validating and infuriating. Maddie hadn't just manipulated my grandparents. She had forged their signatures to make herself the sole beneficiary. Catherine filed a motion to include the forensic report in our case, and the judge granted it. Maddie's lawyer tried to argue that the changes to the will were legitimate, claiming that Helen and Frank might have signed differently due to age or illness. But the forensic expert dismantled that argument, pointing out that even with shaky hands, certain traits in their handwriting would remain unchanged. Amid all this, I discovered something even more damaging. While reviewing bank statements, Catherine noticed a series of large withdrawals from my grandparents' account in the months before their deaths. The money had been funneled into Maddie's account under the pretense of helping with expenses. "What expenses?" I muttered angrily as I looked through the records. A closer look revealed that Maddie had used the funds to buy her luxury car, along with several other extravagant purchases. It was theft, plain and simple. When this evidence was introduced into the case, Maddie's defense started to fall apart. Catherine presented the bank records in court, showing how Maddie had siphoned money from my grandparents' account while they were too frail to stop her. Maddie's reaction was explosive. During one hearing, she stood up and accused me of being greedy and obsessed with money. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "Sam's just mad because Grandma and Grandpa liked me more." Her outburst only made her seem more desperate, and it didn't earn her any sympathy. My parents, who had staunchly supported Maddie from the start, began to waver. My mom looked visibly uncomfortable every time new evidence was presented. My dad, usually more reserved, admitted in a quiet conversation that he wasn't sure Maddie had been truthful. "I don't know what to think anymore," he said, shaking his head. This isn't what I expected. It wasn't what I expected either. But I wasn't going to let Maddie's lies go unchecked. One of the most powerful moments in court came when we played the recordings from Emily. Hearing Helen's voice again brought tears to my eyes, but it also reminded me of why I was fighting. In the recordings, Helen talked about how much the house meant to me and how she wanted me to have it. "She'll take care of it," Helen said in one of the clips. "Sam understands how important this place is to our family." The room was silent as the recordings played. Maddie sat stiffly in her chair, her face pale. By the time the trial reached its final days, the truth was undeniable. The forged signatures, the stolen money, the recordings, all of it painted a clear picture of Maddie's deceit. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. The original will was reinstated, granting me the house and the inheritance my grandparents had intended. Maddie was ordered to return the money she'd taken, including what she had spent on her car. As the ruling was read, Maddie sat frozen, her face a mixture of shock and anger. For the first time, I saw her confidence truly crumble. After the hearing, my parents approached me. My mom, who had defended Maddie so fiercely, looked at me with tears in her eyes. "We're sorry," she said quietly. "We should have believed you." Their apology didn't erase the hurt, but it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The fight had been long and painful, but it was worth it. Helen and Frank had trusted me to do what was right, and I had honored their memory. Maddie's lies were exposed, and justice had been served. For the first time, I felt like I had truly won. Not just the house, but the chance to move forward with my life. Winning the case felt like the end of a long, bitter war. I had fought for my grandparents' legacy and won, but the victory was bittersweet. The house, my grandparents' home, was finally mine, just as they had intended. Yet the process of getting here had left cracks in my family that might never fully heal. A few weeks after the court ruling, I moved into the house. Stepping through the front door felt surreal. The creaky floorboards and the faint scent of lavender brought back so many memories. I half expected to hear Helen humming in the kitchen, or Frank's deep chuckle coming from the garden. It was comforting and heartbreaking all at once. I knew I couldn't just let the house remain as a reminder of all the tension and grief. I decided to breathe new life into it while preserving the charm my grandparents loved. Renovations began almost immediately. I repainted the walls, updated the kitchen, and restored the worn-out furniture that had seen decades of family gatherings. In the garden, I planted rows of lavender and roses, just like Helen used to have. During one of my cleaning sprees, I found an old box tucked away in the back of a closet. Inside were treasures that made me laugh and cry. A stack of Helen's handwritten recipes, Frank's pocket watch, and even a bundle of letters they had exchanged when they were younger. Among the letters was one addressed to me. In it, they wrote about how proud they were of the person I had become. They reminded me of the importance of family, resilience, and standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult it might be. They also shared their hope that the house would continue to be a place of love and warmth, just as it had been for them. That letter became my anchor as I worked to rebuild what the fight had shattered. My parents, Caroline and Richard, made efforts to mend our relationship. My mom started showing up with little gifts, homemade casseroles or flowers for the garden. My dad offered to help with small repairs around the house. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was something. I decided to meet them halfway. I didn't forget how they had defended Maddie at my expense, but I could see they were trying to make amends. Maddie, on the other hand, vanished. She didn't attend family gatherings, and the few times I heard about her, it was through whispers. Her flashy lifestyle had collapsed under the weight of legal fees and her tarnished reputation. Her luxury car was repossessed, and she had reportedly left town. Part of me felt a pang of sadness for her, but it was overshadowed by the choices she had made. The house became my sanctuary, a place to start fresh. I wanted to honor my grandparents' memory in a meaningful way, so I used a portion of the inheritance to start a small charity in their name. The organization focused on helping seniors with home repairs, inspired by the countless times Frank had fixed fences or leaky roofs for neighbors without expecting anything in return. The charity gained traction quickly, with local businesses and volunteers stepping in to help. It felt like something Helen and Frank would have been proud of. I also began reconnecting with extended family. Some relatives reached out to apologize for believing Maddie's lies, while others brought old family heirlooms to contribute to the house. One aunt gifted me a beautiful quilt Helen had made years ago, and a cousin shared framed photos of past family reunions. Slowly, the house transformed into a living tribute to my grandparents and the family they had built. To celebrate the renovations and the charity launch, I hosted a small family gathering at the house. Only the relatives who had supported me or reached out to mend relationships were invited. It was a modest event, filled with homemade food and laughter. For the first time in a long time, the house felt alive again, filled with the kind of joy Helen and Frank would have loved. Maddie's absence was noticeable, but no one brought her up. The peace I felt sitting in the garden that evening was unlike anything I had experienced in years. The fight was over, the truth had come out, and my grandparents' wishes had been honored. I know the scars from this ordeal will always be there. My relationship with Maddie may never recover, and the trust once lost in my parents will take time to rebuild. But I've made peace with that. Some wounds take longer to heal, or may never heal at all. What matters is that I stood my ground and did what was right, just as Helen and Frank would have wanted. Their legacy isn't just the house. It's the lessons they taught me about resilience, integrity, and love. As I sit here, surrounded by the lavender plants swaying in the evening breeze, I feel their presence in every corner of this home. I carry them with me in everything I do, and for that, I'll always be grateful.